Hey friends, tonight we're unraveling one of the weirdest and most haunting mysteries from Europe's past. What really happened when medieval royals kept marrying their own cousins, generation after generation? Let's just say things got a little twisted, and not in a good way. If you're the kind of person who enjoys history that's a bit dark, a little quirky, and full of unbelievable true stories, you're in the right place. Before we get started, hit that like button and subscribe if you find yourself drawn into these late-night journeys through the stranger corners of history. Imagine a world lit by the glow of candles and the steady hum of whispered intrigues, where heavy stone corridors echo with the footsteps of courtiers wrapped in velvet and silk. Here, beneath soaring arches and tapestries rich with golden threads, every decision ripples outwards, shaping not just kingdoms, but the very blood that pulses in royal veins. In this world, the illusion of fairy tale romance falls away almost instantly, replaced by a stark reality. For Europe's ruling families, marriage was never about love or even happiness. It was a game of survival, a cold, intricate dance of power, legacy, and control. The fate of entire continents hung on the choice of a spouse, and no risk was considered too great, no union too close. The story that begins here is not a romance, but a riddle woven through centuries. Why did these families, crowned and cloaked in authority, keep choosing to marry their own kin, generation after generation? To understand, step into a torch-lit hall, heavy with the scent of beeswax and history. Picture a king, his face lined by years and ambition, signing a marriage contract for his daughter. She is a child, perhaps only 13, her face pale but composed, trained from birth to hide every fear. Her bridegroom waits nearby, his title impressive, his lineage familiar, sometimes too familiar. He might be her cousin, her uncle, even her nephew. The ink dries on the page, and with that, two ancient bloodlines twist ever tighter. Outside, the world shifts, borders realign. Armies stand down, fortunes change hands, and yet no one in the Great Hall considers that something irreversible has just happened, not to a kingdom, but to the invisible code that shapes a human being. The logic behind this pattern was, in its own way, simple and chilling. For kings and queens, the purity of a bloodline was an obsession that went far beyond myth. Every marriage was a strategic move, designed to keep castles, lands, and titles within the family. To marry a foreigner was to risk losing influence, to risk raising a rival's heir on your own soil. Better, the reasoning went, to marry within the circle, to keep power contained, unbroken, and under control. It didn't matter that these unions sometimes meant bending the rules of nature. The drive for security overwhelmed any thought for what might be passed down, silent and unseen through generations.
Royal children grew up knowing that family meant everything, and at the same time meant far too much. They watched as their mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles arranged marriages not for affection but for alliance. Each new union, each carefully plotted birth was a reinforcement of dynastic strength, a knot in a net designed to catch every threat to the family's future. But in this relentless pursuit of stability, something strange began to happen. Family trees, meant to branch and flourish, instead began to coil inward. Names repeated themselves, faces blurred together, and soon the line between cousin and spouse faded until it almost disappeared. Behind every royal portrait hangs a shadow. The faces stare out, proud and serene, but within their eyes lies a secret. The consequences of these choices could not be hidden forever. Whispers began to travel down cold stone corridors, whispers of infants born too fragile to survive, of sons and daughters afflicted by mysterious ailments, of moods that darkened and tempers that snapped. Some symptoms were impossible to ignore: jaws that jutted, chins that lengthened, minds that wandered or clouded, hearts that broke under pressure. Yet for every visible sign, there were a dozen more invisible. Weaknesses in the blood, sadnesses that could not be soothed, anxieties that flared for no reason anyone could name. Still, the dance continued. Even when the Church, that ancient guardian of law and morality, raised a tentative hand, the rules were bent. Papal dispensations were granted with a nod and a flourish, holy permission for cousin to marry cousin as long as the peace was kept. The strategy was too valuable, the stakes too high for hesitation. So generation after generation, kings and queens watched as their families twisted ever tighter, the cost mounting silently in the background. The world outside the castle walls shifted and surged with change, but inside, the code of blood held firm. Royal daughters became pawns and prizes, sent across borders to tie alliances, their own wishes irrelevant. In their stories, often buried, rarely told in full, lies the true cost of this obsession. They were the living proof of a gamble gone wrong, forced to carry burdens they did not choose, to bear children whose fate was sealed before birth. Yet their lives, caught at the intersection of power and tragedy, reveal more than the downfall of dynasties. They show the dangerous beauty of ambition and the price of believing that destiny can be controlled.
As centuries unfolded, the legend of royal blood only grew. Tales of purity, of the divine right to rule, were whispered in every court. But the truth was darker. The myth was never just about blue blood or sacred inheritance. It was about the desperate hope that if the right choices were made, the past could be locked in, the future secured. It was a fragile hope, one that could not stand forever against the weight of nature's laws. This is the mystery at the heart of Europe's royal families, the secret history of marriages built on strategy, not affection, and the legacy of daughters born into a world where their lives were mapped out before they took their first breath. The echo of their stories lingers in the halls and portraits, in the faded crests and carefully penned letters. Behind every crown, every title, lies the question that haunts this tale. Was it worth it? And what, in the end, did they truly pass down? In the chapters that follow, we'll walk these shadowed corridors, pausing at the doors where destinies shifted, where hope was raised and quietly undone. We will meet those who played their part with quiet courage and those whose stories ended in quiet tragedy. Through their lives, the twisted code of Europe's royal bloodlines unfolds, not as a warning, not as a fairy tale, but as a living puzzle, waiting to be understood. In the shadowy heart of medieval Europe, the most valuable currency was not gold, nor land, nor even the sword. It was blood. And not just any blood, but blood that had been carefully guarded, traced and measured for purity, as if its power could be hoarded like treasure in a locked chest. Within these royal families, the logic of marriage unfolded according to rules far older and stranger than love. It was a logic built on generations of caution and calculation, on a kind of chess where every piece on the board was a living, breathing child, and every move risked not just fortune, but the very shape of the future. Dynastic politics demanded a kind of ruthless arithmetic. Every noble house looked anxiously at its borders, seeing not just fields and towns, but potential threats to its claim. The greatest danger was not an enemy army, but a rival with a legitimate right to the throne. To guard against this, marriages were arranged like alliances in a game of perpetual war, always inward, always tightening the circle. A daughter who married outside the family was a door left ajar. Her children might one day press a claim against her brothers or pull loyalty away from the dynasty she left behind. Far safer to keep marriages close, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, brother to sister, so that property, power, and legitimacy remained firmly in the grip of the chosen bloodline.
This pattern wasn't born out of ignorance or whimsy. It was a shield raised against chaos. The memory of civil war haunted every noble house, disputed inheritances, branches of the family tree growing wild and threatening the central trunk. The solution, or so it seemed, was to prune ruthlessly. By arranging marriages within the family, noble houses tried to prevent the splintering of their lands, the dilution of their rights. Marrying a cousin did not just keep castles from falling into enemy hands, it kept a rival's banner from being raised within the walls of your own home. But every solution brings its own risks. In the quiet corners of these great halls, some must have noticed how the same names echoed again and again at family gatherings, how family portraits grew eerily similar from one generation to the next. The logic of inheritance was absolute, but the cost was only starting to reveal itself. At first, these costs were whispers: an infant who failed to thrive, a nobleman's sudden illness, a young woman whose mind seemed to fray under invisible pressure. Yet with each generation, the evidence mounted. Nature does not like closed loops. The tighter the family circle, the higher the price paid in fragile bodies, restless minds, and mysterious ailments that no doctor or priest could cure. Still, the politics of blood proved irresistible. Across Europe, dynasties from Spain to Austria, France to Portugal returned to this same pattern, weaving an ever denser net of shared ancestry. It was a system that demanded vigilance, secrecy, and sometimes a convenient forgetting of the rules. Even the Church, guardian of souls and defender of doctrine, found ways to look aside. Though cousin marriage was officially frowned upon, papal dispensations could always be arranged for royalty if the political balance required it. The fate of kingdoms hung in the balance, and so, inevitably, did the lives of their daughters. For these royal daughters, the rules were absolute. There would be no choosing of partners, no dreams of a distant prince or daring romance. Instead, each was raised as a vessel for her family's ambition. Her marriage would be arranged, her children counted, her happiness a secondary concern at best. She would be sent, often as a teenager, to a strange court, sometimes to stand beside a husband who was as much her brother as her spouse. Each union was meant to reinforce the family, but each also carried a secret risk, the kind that could not be measured until it was too late.
Through centuries, the cycle repeated. Marriages arranged to protect the crown, to keep power close, to prevent the fracturing of empire. But behind every treaty and every carefully penned contract was a gamble, a bet that nature would bend to the will of men, that power could be preserved without consequence. It was a bet that, over time, grew ever more dangerous. For every peace won and border secured, there were hidden costs, small at first, then impossible to ignore. The daughters of Europe's great houses became both the architects and the victims of this genetic fortress, bearing on their shoulders the hopes of generations and the invisible weight of a choice that was never truly theirs to make. It is in these tangled roots that our story takes hold, and it is here that the quiet tragedy of royal Europe truly begins. The world outside could change, a new faith, a new war, a new discovery. But within the great houses, the logic of blood and power endured, tightening its grip with every generation. And as we trace these hidden lines from castle to castle, the echo of their choices still lingers in the stones, waiting to be heard. In the candlelit silence of Europe's greatest palaces, you could trace the lineages of kings and queens not on a branching tree, but on a twisting ring, a genetic wreath, each generation looping back into itself. If you stood before a tapestry of royal ancestry, you wouldn't see the familiar lines spreading outward in search of new branches. Instead, you'd find names repeating, faces growing uncannily similar, and marriages forming closed circles rather than new connections. This was nowhere more vivid nor more haunting than in the story of the Habsburgs, whose family web would become infamous across the continent, a living lesson in the risks of too much closeness. The Habsburgs did not invent the strategy, but they perfected it with a determination that bordered on obsession. Their ambition was legendary, an ambition that stretched from the Alps to the farthest reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, from the green valleys of Austria to the sunlit courts of Spain. For them, each marriage was a move in a game that spanned centuries. They understood, perhaps better than any other dynasty, the power of keeping bloodlines contained. Why let wealth and land slip through the fingers of a daughter sent abroad? Why risk a foreign prince raising your grandson to serve another crown? Far safer, far smarter to marry within the family, folding alliances ever inward.
The result was a lineage so entangled that, by the late Renaissance, Habsburg family gatherings must have felt less like reunions and more like a closed circuit. The same ancestors appeared on both sides of every union. Cousins became spouses, aunts became mothers-in-law, and sisters, sometimes even grandmothers. The tapestry of relationships tightened until even the most skilled genealogists struggled to follow the threads. A glance at a Habsburg family chart was enough to make the mind reel. Loops, twists, and crossings, names that seemed to echo down the centuries like a haunting refrain. But the consequences of this strategy could not be confined to dusty parchments and painted portraits. The proof was written, slowly and unmistakably, on the faces and in the bodies of their descendants. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a pronounced and sometimes severe protrusion of the lower face, became both a family trademark and a living symbol of the dangers of inbreeding. Physicians and courtiers alike noted the way jaws grew longer, chins jutted forward, and features lost the symmetry that had once been the pride of their ancestors. But these outward signs were just a beginning. Inside the royal nurseries, stories whispered of more troubling symptoms. Children born delicate, with frail bodies and mysterious ailments. Sons and daughters struggling with speech, movement, or learning. Some would grow to adulthood, ruling empires with a heavy sense of destiny, but others faded quickly, their lives marked by constant illness or clouded minds. Each generation seemed to carry forward a little more of the burden, an extra shadow behind the throne, a new worry for every hopeful parent. And always, in the background, the family tree wound ever tighter, promising security and delivering bit by bit the opposite. The Habsburgs were not alone in this. The Capetians of France, the Trastamaras of Spain, the Plantagenets of England, all fell at one point or another under the same spell. The logic was universal. If power could be concentrated through marriage, why look outward at all? Yet, the more these dynasties tried to guard their fortunes, the more they sealed themselves off, creating a world where every wedding was a risk and every birth a test of luck.
From their earliest days, these young women understood the rules of their world without ever needing to be told. Each lesson in the nursery, every etiquette brill or history tale, whispered the same truth. Their value was measured in their lineage, their obedience, and their ability to carry the family's hopes into the next generation. For a royal daughter, childhood was not a time of innocence, but a careful preparation for duty. Every dance learned, every language mastered, every hour spent perfecting composure was a step along a path that led inexorably to a marriage contract inked by someone else's hand. These marriages were more than social events, they were acts of state, calculated with precision and often decided years before a girl could truly comprehend her own fate. A princess's hand in marriage was a promise, a way to forge alliances, secure borders, and quiet restless rivals. But the closer these alliances drew, the narrower the circle became. With every cousin wedded to a cousin, with every aunt paired to a nephew, the net grew tighter. In this genetic labyrinth, the princess became the key that unlocked both triumph and tragedy for her house. The burden was immense. While princes might rebel, vanish to distant lands, or fall in battle, princesses rarely had the freedom to shape their own stories. Their duty was to marry as instructed and produce heirs, strong, healthy, legitimate children who would carry the bloodline forward. It was a duty fraught with danger, both seen and unseen. Behind closed doors, the reality of these unions often revealed itself in long, lonely nights, in pregnancies that risked the princess's health, in the silent tally of infants lost before their first year. Each loss was quietly mourned, but rarely discussed, folded into the fabric of courtly life as just another price to be paid for stability. Beyond the physical risks, there lingered the unspoken toll of constant expectation. Royal daughters learned to mask their fears and sadness, to wear the mask of composure no matter the cost. A smile at a banquet could hide heartbreak. A gentle nod could conceal the knowledge that one's body was not just one's own, but the property of an entire nation. Letters sent home, when allowed, spoke obliquely of homesickness, of foreign customs that chilled the heart, of longing for the voices of mothers and sisters left behind. Yet these small rebellions found little place in a world that demanded endurance, silence, and absolute loyalty. Even when a princess found a kindred spirit in her new home, the reality of her mission never faded. She was expected to navigate the intricate webs of her new court, earning the trust of strangers, balancing old loyalties with new duties, and, above all, securing the future with each birth. If she succeeded, she might be quietly praised, though the credit often went to her husband, the king. If she failed, whether through misfortune or the mysterious workings of heredity, the blame could be swift and devastating. There were always whispers. Is the queen cursed? Did she bring weakness into the bloodline? Would a different bride have given the kingdom the sons it needed?
Over time, even the church grew wary, quietly tracking the degrees of separation between bride and groom. Popes granted dispensations with a sigh, but everyone knew the truth. There were fewer and fewer outsiders left who could match a royal family's standards. Each generation, the pool grew smaller, the choices more limited, and so the genetic circle closed, not just for the Habsburgs, but for an entire class of families who believed that legacy could be insulated from fate. If you looked past the jewels and titles, the triumphs and pageantry, you would see a dynasty quietly fraying from within. Faces in portraits seemed to blur together, eyes set too close, jaws too broad, expressions heavy with the knowledge of secrets never spoken aloud. Family legends grew more complicated, stories darker and stranger, as if the very stones of the castles remembered every price paid for loyalty to blood. As the centuries marched on, the wreath of royal ancestry became not a symbol of strength, but a quiet warning. The logic that had once kept empires strong now seeded the ground for decline, planting hidden weaknesses in the heart of every family it touched. And so, beneath the surface of Europe's golden age, the family tree twisted inward, its roots seeking not new soil, but the same old ground again and again. In this closed circle, beauty and tragedy intertwined, and the fate of nations became inseparable from the fate of daughters born to carry the weight of so many choices. The rings of ancestry, each one tighter than the last, would echo through every story to come, setting the stage for a cascade of destinies as fragile as they were fateful. In the grand theaters of royal courts, where every gesture was measured and every glance could carry the weight of nations, daughters born to kings and queens found their destinies mapped out before their first breath. If royal blood was the currency of empire,
it was the princesses who became both its guardians and its most vulnerable vessels. The sons of dynasties might ride into battle, sign treaties, or inherit smones, but it was the daughters who bore the deepest marks of ambition, a legacy written in flesh and bone, in silent sacrifices, in choices never truly theirs.
This endless scrutiny, this subtle but unyielding pressure, forged a unique kind of courage. Many royal daughters rose to the challenge, wielding what power they could, through diplomacy, patronage, or even subtle defiance. Some left their mark as regents, counselors, or protectors of their children's rights. But the price was never far from view. Each generation carried the genetic consequences a little further, each union tightening the noose of expectation and risk. When illnesses surfaced, when children struggled, when minds wavered or bodies weakened, it was often the mothers, the princesses turned queens, who bore the private agony of knowing that duty had demanded so much. Beneath the crowns and jewels, the stories of these women beat like a hidden pulse. Their lives became a testament to the limits of control, to the unpredictable patterns woven by love and loyalty, strategy and survival. Their sacrifices rarely made the official histories. Yet, in every echoing hallway, behind every portrait, their presence lingers, a reminder that the price of empire was always paid, most dearly by those whose voices were heard only in whispers. Through their silent endurance and fleeting moments of power, royal daughters left a legacy more enduring than any treaty or throne. And in the quiet spaces between history's grand events, their resilience still speaks to the cost of building empires on a foundation of blood. It began quietly, as all the most dangerous secrets do, first as a whisper behind closed doors, then as an anxious glance exchanged between courtiers, a pause in the royal nursery when a baby failed to cry with vigor, or a child's features seemed subtly askew. For generations, Europe's ruling families had trusted in the logic of their dynastic strategies, believing that every risk was justified by the rewards of secure borders and consolidated power. But nature, indifferent to the ambitions of kings and queens, began to reveal its own truth. The signs of trouble were subtle at first, easy to dismiss or hide, especially in a world where reputation was everything, and to admit weakness was to invite disaster.
A noble infant might be born delicate, with skin too pale or limbs too thin, and the midwives would murmur that the Lord works in mysterious ways. A princess might reach adolescence only to be plagued by mysterious fevers, endless headaches, or moods that darkened without warning. Sometimes the marks were more visible, a chin that jutted sharply, eyes set too close, or a gait that never quite seemed steady. Yet to speak of these things openly was forbidden. In an age where the health of a single child could decide the fate of a kingdom, every family became skilled in the art of silence. The most persistent symptoms, however, could not be explained away forever. Some families became notorious for their peculiarities. The Habsburg jaw, with its unmistakable thrust, became the subject of anxious gossip. At banquets and balls, visiting ambassadors might remark on the uncanny similarities between cousins, on how entire generations seemed carved from the same fragile clay. When children failed to survive beyond infancy or suffered from lingering ailments, it was quietly attributed to God's will, a divine test, or even a curse. Only rarely did anyone dare whisper the truth, that perhaps the circle had grown too tight, that nature itself was rebelling against centuries of careful calculation. Alongside physical changes, there were other shadows. Minds frayed at the edges, some young women, once lively and intelligent, began to withdraw into silence or fits of melancholy. At times, the line between grief and instability blurred as queens and princesses succumbed to moods that the doctors of the time could neither understand nor cure. In an era when emotional turmoil was poorly understood, these episodes were chalked up to nerves, to feminine weakness, or, again, to God's unknowable plan. But for those who lived inside these palaces, the patterns were impossible to miss. Mothers who lost child after child, fathers who watched their heirs falter, their hopes dimming one by one. Ministers and confessors exchanged worried glances, but rarely did any voice the growing suspicion. The Church, whose authority was unquestioned in matters both spiritual and political, found itself caught in a web of contradictions. Its own laws forbade marriages between close kin, but it also recognized the supreme importance of peace and unity in Christian Europe. As a result, loopholes and exceptions multiplied. Papal dispensations, special permissions granted by the Pope, became routine. In public, the rules were strict. In private, they bent like reeds in the wind.
Even as the evidence mounted, bodies weakened, minds clouded, futures cut short, the stories told at court remained unchanged. The suffering of royal children was woven into the larger narrative of fate and faith. Chroniclers penned tales of miraculous recoveries, holy interventions, or noble acceptance of misfortune. But beneath the surface, the families themselves began to understand that something was deeply wrong, something that could not be blamed on the stars or on foreign enemies. In the rare moments when the truth threatened to spill into the open, it was quickly swept back under layers of ritual and tradition. Portraits were retouched, official records carefully edited, and priests instructed to comfort rather than question. The silent agreement was simple. To speak openly of these taboos would threaten not just individual reputations, but the very stability of kingdoms. Better, it seemed, to bear the cost in private, to endure the heartbreak with stoic resolve, than to admit to the world that the foundation of empire might be cracked from within. Thus, the first tremors of reckoning moved quietly through the halls of power, barely acknowledged, yet impossible to ignore. The cost of generations of insular marriage was beginning to rise, and as the years turned, the symptoms would only grow sharper, the secrets harder to conceal. The families of Europe could not yet name the danger stalking their lineages, but they could feel its presence, as inexorable as time, and as silent as a prayer whispered in the night. In the flickering half-light of Brussels' royal chambers, Isabella of Habsburg entered the world already bound by the invisible chains of family ambition. Born in 1501, she was a child marked from her very first breath by the tangled lines of her ancestry. Her mother, Joanna of Castile, carried the haunting weight of her own troubled blood, while her father, Philip the Handsome, embodied the Habsburg dream, ambition without limits, and a family tree that no longer branched but curled back upon itself. For Isabella, childhood was less a time of play and discovery, and more a season of preparation for her role as living evidence of dynastic intent. From the earliest days, Isabella's world was ordered and rigid. Tutors taught her not just languages, though she mastered Latin, Castilian, French, German, and Flemish with the fluency of a born diplomat, but also the unspoken codes of royal survival. She watched her elders speak in careful circles, always aware of who was listening, always weighing their words. Her smiles were measured, her glances trained to reflect humility and understanding. Yet beneath the velvet gowns and courtly grace, a constant tension ran through her life, a silent knowledge that she would soon become a tool in the family's endless pursuit of power.
By her early teens, Isabella's fate was sealed. She was chosen as the link to bind the Habsburgs to the Scandinavian thrones, sent north to marry Christian II, the brooding, mercurial ruler of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It was not a match of affection, but of calculation, an alliance born of treaties and sealed with expectation. She was little more than a child when she arrived at his chilly court, the grandeur of her entrance shadowed by an undercurrent of unease. Christian was a ruler of uncertain moods, with a penchant for defiance and a beloved mistress he would not abandon. The cold stone walls of her new home seemed to close around her, their silence broken only by the whispers of courtiers who measured every step she took. Yet Isabella was no passive observer. Even as she found herself surrounded by unfamiliar faces, her presence began to ripple through the Danish court. She navigated the delicate balance of power with a careful intelligence, seeking out allies and cultivating her own sphere of influence. When tragedy struck, when the king's mistress suddenly disappeared, a swirl of rumors and quiet accusations clouding the air, Isabella did not flinch. Whether her hand played any part in the event remains lost to time, but from that moment, her authority only grew. The queen became more than a symbol. She became a force, quietly guiding the affairs of state, while never overstepping the boundaries drawn for her. Still, the legacy of her blood was impossible to outrun. Illness stalked Isabella throughout her brief life, episodes of frailty that left physicians perplexed and courtiers anxious. Some suspected a hereditary disorder, perhaps the shadow of hemophilia, or another secret gift of her lineage. The details were hidden behind courtly politeness, but whispers persisted. Isabella was too often confined to her rooms, her skin sometimes as pale as the northern sky, her strength failing her at the moments she was most needed. Despite these struggles, she bore 6 children, 3 of whom survived their earliest years, a fragile victory in a world where infant loss was common, but always more devastating in dynasties that demanded heirs above all else. Her daughter Dorothea would marry yet another cousin, repeating the pattern that had shaped her mother's fate. The genetic circle continued to tighten, each generation a little less certain, a little more vulnerable to the silent consequences no one dared name.
Isabella's final years were marked by a growing sense of isolation. The grandeur of court ceremonies could not conceal the ache of her body, nor the chill of a home that never truly welcomed her. She corresponded with relatives and diplomats in every language she knew, her letters sharp and sometimes laced with quiet irony. She saw clearly the machinery of power at work, how every marriage, every birth, every whispered alliance drew the net tighter. Yet her role left little room for rebellion. She played her part, bearing the burdens of her blood with the dignity expected of her station. Her life, as brief as it was, left a mark on history's ledger. Officially, Isabella succumbed to a sudden illness at the age of just 24, a vague diagnosis that covered every possibility from inherited disease to the exhaustion of endless expectation. In the hushed aftermath, her absence lingered in the halls of power, a reminder that no strategy is without its price. Those who came after her carried her blood, and with it, the lessons of her fate, that even the strongest dynasties are only as unbreakable as the bodies and spirits of those born to serve them. Isabella of Habsburg became a cautionary tale whispered behind palace doors. Her story of duty, resilience, and quiet struggle revealed the hidden costs of a policy that valued legacy above life. In the generations that followed,
Her name echoed through the family's chronicles, a silent warning wrapped in silk and sorrow. In the echoing halls of Castile, where banners hung heavy with centuries of triumph and betrayal, a young princess named Joanna entered the world, the third child of two of Spain's most celebrated monarchs. Her mother, Isabella II of Castile, was a legend in her own right. Her father, Ferdinand II of Aragon, was every inch a king. From the start, Joanna's life was wrapped in the kind of expectations that could bend iron. Born into a union that was itself a tangle of shared ancestry and competing ambitions, Joanna was marked as both a prize and a pawn in Europe's dynastic chess game. The pressures of family, power, and blood were her inheritance, as inescapable as the stone walls of the palaces she called home. Joanna's childhood was defined by rigor and ritual. She was groomed not just for piety and learning, but for obedience to a future no one asked her to choose. She excelled in languages and the etiquette of courtly life, yet her world was narrow, confined by protocol and the relentless rhythm of political necessity. Her parents, second cousins by blood, had unified Spain and now looked beyond its borders, searching for alliances that would secure their realm for generations to come. For Joanna, that meant a future measured not by dreams, but by the needs of the crown.
At 16, Joanna's path led her far from Spain, to the court of Flanders and a marriage to Philip the Handsome, a prince whose beauty was matched only by his restless ambition. Their union was supposed to cement the alliance between Spain and the Habsburgs, another family whose branches curled tightly back upon themselves. For a brief moment, love and passion seemed to break through the calculation. Their attraction was real, even overwhelming. But the intensity that drew them together soon became a source of turmoil. Philip's charm attracted more than just Joanna's devotion, and his infidelities were as open as they were wounding. Joanna's jealousy, her fierce and public longing for his affection, was met with ridicule and, eventually, suspicion. What began as the heartache of a neglected wife quickly took on a darker tone. In a world where a queen's emotions could be weaponized, every outburst, every tear became a tool for those who wished to undermine her. As Philip distanced himself, surrounding Joanna with rivals and whisperers, the court began to question her stability. Stories circulated of nights spent wandering the halls, of scenes of grief that blurred the line between mourning and madness. After Philip's sudden passing, Joanna's grief was so intense that she refused to be parted from his body, traveling from monastery to monastery with his casket, an image that would haunt her legacy for centuries. Yet the narrative of madness was not just a reflection of Joanna's private pain. It was a convenient solution for powerful men eager to control her inheritance. Her father, Ferdinand, and her husband's allies all sought to keep the keys to Castile within their grasp. By declaring Joanna unfit to rule, they could bypass her authority while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. The result was a slow, relentless campaign to erode her credibility, confining her in chilly castles, surrounding her with attendants who watched her every move, and using her suffering as justification for stripping her of agency. Behind the public spectacle, there were deeper shadows, threads of melancholy and instability that might have run through her bloodline, passed quietly from generation to generation. Joanna's parents were related, as were she and Philip. Their children, including Isabella of Habsburg, would inherit this concentrated ancestry, raising new questions for every faded portrait and lost diary. Some historians would later suggest that Joanna's struggles were not just the product of circumstance, but of a genetic load growing heavier with each carefully calculated marriage. Yet even this is only part of the story.
For Joanna, madness was never a simple diagnosis. It was a blend of heartbreak, manipulation, and inherited vulnerability, woven together by a society that refused to see a woman's pain as anything but weakness. The physicians of her time proposed all manner of explanations, from wandering wombs to divine punishment. She was prayed over, isolated, and at times subjected to rituals meant to drive out invisible demons. None of it brought her peace. Her children were taken from her, her signature affixed to documents by others, her very presence at court reduced to a symbol, useful only so long as she remained silent. For nearly 50 years, Joanna endured this living exile. She was technically queen, but only in name. Locked in her fortress, she watched the outside world change, her children's lives unfolding without her, the fortunes of Spain rising and falling. Sometimes letters would slip through, carrying news of distant events or the briefest comfort from those who remembered her not as the madwoman of legend, but as the clever, passionate daughter she had once been. Joanna's story is not just one of tragedy, but of warning, a lesson in how dynastic ambition and the weight of blood can combine to crush the human spirit. Her legacy endures in the questions she leaves behind. How much of her pain was fate, and how much was the product of a world built on control? Was her madness an illness, or the only possible response to a life where love was dangerous and power even more so? Her name, whispered through the centuries, became a symbol not just of loss, but of the price paid by those who found themselves at the intersection of family, politics, and the relentless quest for dynasty. The story drifts now from the stony fortresses of Castile to the lush, temperate heart of France, a world of high-vaulted cathedrals, perfumed gardens, and courtly intrigue, where power moved with the subtlety of silk. Here, under the watchful gaze of saints and sovereigns, the same forces that shaped the fates of Spanish princesses were at work. It is in this new setting that we meet Blanche of Castile, a woman whose quiet determination would ripple through French history, and whose life would reveal how dynastic pressure was never limited by borders.
Blanche was born into privilege, the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and the daughter of the ruling house of Castile, herself a product of the tangled roots of Europe's great dynasties. From her earliest years, Blanche understood her worth was measured in alliances and expectations. Her destiny, set out before her in meticulous ink, was to bind France and Spain, to be the living seal on a treaty that could shape the future of both kingdoms. At just 12 years old, Blanche crossed the Pyrenees, her fate already decided in hushed council chambers and illuminated letters. She was not the original choice for the French crown. A last-minute decision by nervous advisors saw her replace her sister, a move that historians would debate for centuries. Perhaps it was temperament, perhaps an early glimpse of inherited instability in her sibling, or perhaps only the invisible calculations that governed so many royal decisions. Regardless, Blanche was thrust into the glittering, treacherous orbit of the French court. Her new world was one of constant performance, of subtle battles fought with etiquette and suggestion rather than open force. The Capetian court, for all its grandeur, was fiercely insular. The French aristocracy valued bloodlines with the same fervor as their Spanish and Austrian peers, and marriages were arranged with similar disregard for genetic variety. Blanche's own union with Louis VIII required a papal dispensation, for they were third cousins, a detail quietly noted but considered worth the risk for the sake of continuity. Blanche adapted swiftly. Though still a child in years, she was a quick study in the language of power, understanding that her survival depended not only on producing heirs, but on mastering the subtle politics that ran beneath the surface of every gathering. When her husband ascended the throne, Blanche became Queen of France. And when Louis died unexpectedly, leaving their son a minor, she stepped into a role few women of her time could ever imagine: regent for the Kingdom of France. The court was skeptical. Male advisors eyed her with thinly disguised suspicion, while rival families circled hungrily, sensing an opportunity to loosen the royal grip. But Blanche was neither timid nor easily swayed.
With a composure sharpened by years of training and the cold clarity that came from her own dynastic education, she took control. She negotiated with rebellious nobles, enforced royal authority, and even outmaneuvered the Pope in disputes that threatened the delicate balance of church and crown.
Underneath her firm rule, however, the private cost remained. Blanche bore 13 children, but only a handful survived to adulthood, a pattern painfully familiar in royal houses where shared ancestry was a point of pride. The rumors of inherited frailty and recurring illnesses dogged her family, each new loss another reminder that strategy had its own price. Her most famous son, Louis IX, would become a saint, his health and devotion legendary. Yet several of his siblings struggled, their short lives shadowed by ailments the doctors of the day could only describe as melancholia or divine testing. There were subtler signs as well. Letters and accounts from Blanche's inner circle mention her own struggles. Periodic headaches so severe they left her unable to govern. Stretches of somber reflection that might today be recognized as depression. In an age where royal suffering was always seen through a spiritual or political lens, such moments were described as mystical experiences, visions granted by God to a chosen queen. Yet beneath the layers of piety and symbolism, a more human struggle played out. The effort to maintain control while carrying the hidden burdens of a family line wound too tightly. Despite these challenges, Blanche's reign as regent was marked by resilience. She defended the monarchy during her son's minority, negotiated alliances, suppressed rebellions, and managed to maintain stability in a court famous for its intrigue. Even as dynastic pressures mounted and personal sacrifices accumulated, Blanche left an indelible mark on French history, not simply as a mother or a wife, but as a ruler who managed, against the odds, to hold her kingdom together. Yet, for all her political acumen, the legacy she passed on was a familiar one, a dynasty strengthened on paper but ever more fragile beneath the surface. The French court's own experiments with close marriages would echo through later generations, as other royal women found themselves navigating the same perilous balance of power, loyalty, and fate. Blanche's story endures not just as an example of a woman who triumphed in a man's world, but as a mirror reflecting the deeper truth of Europe's royal families, a truth where victory was always measured against a private, often invisible cost. The French experience, no less than the Spanish or Austrian, proved that even the sharpest mind and strongest will could not fully escape the genetic legacy of dynastic ambition.
Across the sun-baked palaces of Portugal, a girl named Eleanor was born into a world of radiant color and layered tradition. She grew up amidst the sounds of music drifting through orange groves and the laughter of siblings who would one day become rulers themselves. Yet, for Eleanor of Portugal, her family's ambition would soon tear her from all she knew, sending her north into the chill and ceremony of a foreign court, a move that would shape not only her own fate, but the destiny of an empire. Eleanor's lineage, like so many royal children of her era, was marked by a tightening circle. Her father, King Edward of Portugal, and her mother, Eleanor of Aragon, had themselves been matched for reasons of alliance and security, and as a daughter, Eleanor was expected to further this strategy. By the time she reached her teenage years, her future had already been mapped. She would marry Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man whose signature would soon rule over vast stretches of Central Europe. The arrangement was celebrated as a triumph for Portugal, but hidden beneath the pageantry was a secret well understood by those who traced the tangled branches of the family tree. Frederick was not only Eleanor's cousin, but technically her uncle by marriage. The wedding itself was an awkward spectacle. Eleanor journeyed across Europe, leaving behind the warmth of Lisbon for the labyrinthine courts of the empire. When she finally met Frederick, on the very day of their ceremony, she was confronted not just with a stranger, but with the daunting reality of her new role. He was older, methodical, and known more for his obsession with bureaucracy than for warmth or poetry. She was still young, spirited, and burdened by a longing for the familiar. As Empress, Eleanor found herself isolated in a world governed by rules and rituals far removed from the vibrancy of her childhood. The imperial court was severe, its people cautious and cold. She tried to fill her days with music and art, longing for conversation and comfort, but the language barriers and cultural distance left her perpetually alone. Frederick, preoccupied with the daily grind of administration, seemed remote, more partner in paperwork than husband in any meaningful sense. Eleanor's correspondence, carefully preserved through the centuries, offers a rare window into her private pain. Letters to her brother in Portugal speak of homesickness and alienation, of longing for warmth and someone to trust.
The emotional distance soon became physical hardship. Eleanor's health began to decline, first slowly, then with alarming speed. She endured difficult pregnancies, the cold winters of Germany, and a sense of displacement that grew heavier each year. Modern historians have speculated about the cause of her illness. Some suggest she suffered from a hereditary blood disorder, perhaps porphyria, whose symptoms could mimic both physical and mental distress. Others believe her frailty was simply the result of unrelenting stress, homesickness, and the repeated strain of childbirth in an environment that offered little solace. Her body, shaped by generations of careful marriage and restricted choice, bore the silent cost of her family's ambitions. Though she fulfilled her duty by providing heirs, including Maximilian, who would rise to become one of Europe's most powerful rulers, Eleanor's life grew ever more constricted. Her influence at court was limited, her friendships scarce, her days marked by a longing for the sunlight freedom of her youth. Even at the end, as her health faltered, the demands of imperial routine continued unabated. Frederick's absence at her funeral, he remained behind, absorbed in state business, spoke volumes about the nature of their union. Yet Eleanor's legacy echoed through the centuries. Through her son, the Habsburg line would rise to new heights, tightening the genetic circle further as the next generation again turned inward for marriage and alliance. The traces of her suffering and the subtle clues of inherited fragility would become ever more visible in the faces and lives of her descendants. Her story of loneliness, quiet courage, and a duty carried to the edge of endurance became a thread woven into the larger tapestry of a dynasty spiraling toward decline. Eleanor's letters remain among the few artifacts that reveal the private cost of public glory. In their careful lines, she confided her sadness, her longing for home, her frustration with the cold indifference of power. Behind a facade of imperial grandeur, she stands as a symbol for all the daughters and wives who paid the price of ambition with the currency of their own bodies and hearts. Through her journey, the chilling consequences of dynastic strategy become clear. In the end, even the grandest empire may be built on the quiet suffering of a single, exiled soul. Margaret of Austria entered the world with the pedigree of a princess and the keen eyes of a born strategist. Daughter of Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, niece to the ever-expanding Habsburg Empire, her birthright promised privilege and pressure in equal measure. From her earliest days, Margaret stood out for her intelligence and composure. Unlike many of her royal cousins, she was never content to be a pawn. Even as a child, she seemed to sense the invisible boundaries drawn by her family's ambitions, yet she learned quickly that defiance could only go so far within the circle of Habsburg blood.
Her education was rigorous. Her tutors chosen for their brilliance and their loyalty to her father's vision. She spoke several languages, mastered the intricacies of diplomacy, and absorbed the lessons of European politics with an almost frightening acuity.
Yet beneath this cultivated exterior, Margaret carried the burden shared by so many women of her house, a fate shaped not by her mind, but by her blood. Her first engagement, sealed when she was only 3, was to Charles VIII of France, a move that would have created a powerful alliance. But the engagement was broken, a blow not just to Margaret's pride, but to the complex web of treaties her family had woven. In a world where marriages determined the balance of power, such disappointments were never simply personal. They rippled outward, forcing new calculations and often new sacrifices. Margaret's adolescence was defined by these shifting allegiances. She was married off to John, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne and, predictably, a close relative. Their union, hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, was brief. John's early passing left Margaret widowed before she could settle into her new role. She was returned to her father's court, her status now a mixture of valuable asset and tragic symbol, a reminder of how quickly carefully laid plans could unravel. Yet Margaret refused to be sidelined. As Europe's political tides shifted, she was pressed into marriage negotiations again and again, each time with another cousin or distant relative, each time feeling the noose of dynastic tradition tighten. At times, she appeared on the verge of another union, but each arrangement collapsed under the weight of politics, illness, or fate. The repetition of these cycles made Margaret's a rarity among her peers, a Habsburg woman who, by fortune or design, remained single after widowhood. This status, unusual for a princess of her age, became her greatest asset. Appointed as governor of the Netherlands, Margaret at last found a stage equal to her intellect. Here she exercised real power, overseeing a complex web of cities, provinces, and fractious nobles. She corresponded with kings and emperors, negotiated peace treaties, and steered her territories through war and economic upheaval. Her court became a center of art and learning, a rare space where a woman's authority was not just tolerated, but respected. Still, the mark of her bloodline lingered in every decision. The family's preference for close marriages meant that Margaret was constantly drawn into schemes to marry off nieces and nephews, to arrange alliances that would reinforce the Habsburg hold on Europe. Each new match carried the same old risks: fragile children, uncertain futures, the ever-present specter of inherited weakness. Margaret herself, despite her talents, could never fully escape the shadow of her ancestry. Her wisdom and diplomatic skills might have shaped a more open, innovative legacy, but the circle of blood was unbroken. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, the limits placed on even the brightest minds when genetics and tradition worked together to define destiny. Letters and records from Margaret's life reveal flashes of wit, moments of exasperation, and an underlying resolve to make the best of her position. She mentored the next generation of Habsburg women, sharing hard-won lessons about power, patience, and the necessity of compromise. In quieter moments, she may have wondered what her life could have been had she been free to choose her own path. Instead, she poured her energy into governance, diplomacy, and the subtle reshaping of her court's culture. Margaret's legacy stands in stark contrast to the silent suffering of so many royal daughters. She transformed her own constraints into opportunities, wielded her mind as deftly as any statesman, and left behind a model of female rule rare in her time. Yet even for her, the battle of mind against blood was never truly won. In the end, Margaret's story is a testament to both the possibilities and the limitations of intellect when set against the unyielding pattern of dynastic fate. Her achievements glimmer as bright exceptions in the family annals, a reminder that even in a world bound by tradition, one woman's resolve could leave a mark as enduring as any empire. Catherine of Aragon's journey from the sunlit palaces of Spain to the windswept halls of England was never meant to alter the course of an entire continent. Born the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, she grew up surrounded by power, expectation, and the shadows of tightly intertwined ancestry. Her earliest memories were colored by the triumphant completion of the Reconquista and the meticulous negotiations that would secure her place among Europe's great queens. From the start, her future was crafted as a thread woven tightly into the fabric of international alliance. A living bond between Spain and England, two nations whose fortunes would rise and fall on the strength of a royal marriage.
Promised first to Arthur, Prince of Wales, Catherine crossed the Channel as a teenager, stepping into a world of gray stone castles and unfamiliar customs. Her marriage to Arthur was brief, their time together marked by ceremony and uncertainty. When Arthur's life ended not long after their union, Catherine was left in a precarious position. A foreign princess, widowed in a strange land, her destiny suddenly adrift. Yet even in mourning, she remained the center of dynastic ambition. With careful negotiation and papal approval, Catherine was betrothed to Arthur's younger brother, the charismatic and impulsive Henry VIII, a match that would define the next decades of her life and the fate of England itself. Their early years as king and queen held the promise of a powerful partnership. Catherine was admired for her intellect, her dignity, and her resilience. She played a key role in England's diplomacy, advised Henry on matters of state, and worked tirelessly to fulfill her most crucial duty, providing the realm with a male heir. Yet with every passing year, hope turned to anxiety. Catherine suffered a string of pregnancies that ended in heartbreak, children lost before they could secure the future of the Tudor dynasty. Only one child, Mary, survived to adolescence, a bright but controversial legacy in a world that demanded sons. As Catherine struggled in private, her difficulties became a matter of public crisis. For Henry, whose pride and power depended on an undisputed heir, each disappointment was both a personal loss and a national emergency. Advisors, courtiers, and priests whispered explanations. Some pointed to the will of God, others to the peculiarities of royal blood. Quietly, the fact that Catherine and Henry themselves were related through generations of European intermarriage became part of the anxious gossip at court. The same alliances that had bound kingdoms together now seemed to have sown seeds of fragility, a hidden flaw running through the generations. Unable to accept the absence of a son, Henry's frustration grew into obsession. He began to question the validity of his marriage, searching for a justification that would free him to seek another wife. The question of legitimacy, once settled by papal dispensation, now became a battleground. Henry argued that marrying his brother's widow had been a sin against divine law, that their union was cursed from the start, a claim that ignored the years of papal approval and Catherine's own steadfast defense of her rights. The struggle escalated from private anguish to public scandal, as Henry broke with the Pope, declared himself head of the Church of England, and set in motion the English Reformation.
Catherine, caught at the center of this storm, never yielded. Despite mounting pressure, she refused to renounce her title or acknowledge her daughter as illegitimate. Her faith, dignity, and unwavering resolve made her a symbol of resistance, admired by the English people and feared by those who saw her presence as a threat to the new order. Yet the price of her steadfastness was immense. She was separated from her daughter, confined to remote estates, and left to endure her final years far from court, her legacy debated and diminished by those eager to rewrite history. The consequences of Catherine's fate rippled far beyond her own lifetime. Her struggle set the stage for religious upheaval, a generation of political conflict, and a line of succession that would haunt England for decades. The fractures that emerged between Catholic and Protestant, Old Faith and New, mother and daughter, would shape the nation's identity for centuries to come.
Even as the Tudors faded and new dynasties rose, Catherine's story remained at the heart of England's transformation. The tale of a princess whose bloodline carried both hope and catastrophe, and whose endurance reshaped the very soul of a kingdom. In the end, Catherine of Aragon's life was defined not just by her losses, but by her unbreakable spirit. She became the embodiment of a dynasty's ambitions and its limitations, a living link between worlds that could never truly be joined. Through her, the invisible consequences of centuries of royal strategy became impossible to ignore, setting in motion a drama that would echo down the corridors of history long after her voice was silenced. From the sun-drenched courts of Portugal to the solemn grandeur of Spain, Isabella of Portugal's journey was mapped by the relentless currents of dynastic necessity. Born into a lineage already complicated by repeated alliances among close relatives, Isabella embodied the hopes of two nations that valued bloodlines as the foundation of their identity. Her early years were spent among the tutors and attendants of the Portuguese court, her education shaped by both the weight of tradition and the subtle lessons of survival that every royal daughter learned by heart. Yet beneath the silks and ceremony, her fate was sealed not by her own desires, but by a single fateful principle. In the world of royalty, the closer the blood, the stronger the bond.
When Isabella came of age, her marriage prospects were considered with all the precision of a diplomatic treaty. The solution, championed by her family and the Spanish court, was both practical and perilous. She would wed Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who was her double cousin, related through both their mothers and their fathers. This union was celebrated as the perfect consolidation of power, the joining of two mighty lines that had already intertwined across generations. The wedding was a lavish affair, blending the pageantry of Spain with the formality of the imperial court, but the atmosphere was tinged with a sense of inevitability, as if everyone understood that this was not just a marriage, but the closing of a genetic circle. As Empress and Queen, Isabella brought both dignity and intelligence to her role. She managed the court in Charles's frequent absences, demonstrating a talent for diplomacy and a quiet strength that won her respect even among her rivals. Yet, the happiness of her marriage was always shadowed by the pressure to produce heirs, a pressure compounded by the knowledge that each child would carry the legacy of generations of close intermarriage. The court watched anxiously as Isabella endured the trials of childbirth, her health wavering under the strain of repeated pregnancies. The most significant of her children was Philip, the future Philip II of Spain, whose reign would leave an indelible mark on European history. But even as Philip grew under his mother's careful guidance, observers could not ignore the subtle signs of inherited frailty. The pale skin, the delicate health, and the reserved temperament that characterized Philip's youth became subjects of private discussion among the courtiers. In quieter moments, Isabella herself may have wondered about the cost of so many calculated alliances, her thoughts turning to the silent risks that came with each new generation. Isabella's own life became a study in silent endurance. Though her marriage was, by the standards of the time, affectionate, the demands of empire were never far from view. Charles's long absences, his preoccupation with distant campaigns, and the endless expectations placed on Isabella as both consort and mother left her isolated within the marble halls of the palace. Her letters reveal moments of loneliness and fatigue, hints of a gentle soul pressed to the limits by duty. Her passing, after years of declining health, was mourned throughout both Portugal and Spain. Official tributes celebrated her as a model queen and empress, but the private grief of her family was complicated by the knowledge that her story was not unique. Isabella's life was both a symbol and a warning, a reminder of the price paid by royal women who lived and died within the narrowing boundaries of family strategy.
Through Isabella, the genetic circle drew ever tighter, setting the stage for the reign of her son and the growing challenges that would soon face the Habsburg dynasty. The quiet tragedy of her life, echoed in the delicate features and uncertain futures of her children, marked a new chapter in the history of Europe's royal houses. As the doors of the palace closed behind her, the echoes of her story remained, a testament to the cost of forging empires on the foundation of blood and a quiet plea for a future shaped by something more than the demands of inheritance. Maria of Burgundy grew up beneath the shadow of ancient forests and the flicker of candlelight on stained glass, heir to one of Europe's most coveted territories. Her childhood, though filled with pageantry and luxury, was haunted by the knowledge that her future was never truly her own. As the only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Isabella of Bourbon, Maria became the living prize in a contest that stretched from the French court to the distant halls of the Habsburgs. The weight of expectation pressed down on her from the start, every glance and conversation a reminder that her marriage would reshape the balance of power across the continent. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Maria dreamed of something beyond the suffocating embrace of dynastic duty. She was intelligent and independent, skilled in the arts of horsemanship, hunting, and governance. Those close to her spoke of a restless spirit, someone eager to shape her own destiny rather than simply accept the path laid out for her. When her father's life ended suddenly on the battlefield, Maria was thrust into a maelstrom of ambition. Suitors gathered from every direction, each one an agent of a different political scheme, each one a possible jailer in a golden cage. The French crown pressed hardest, eager to absorb Burgundy into its lands by marrying Maria to the Dauphin. Yet, surrounded by counselors and courtiers with their own motives, Maria made a choice that was both brave and perilous. She married Maximilian of Austria, future Holy Roman Emperor and a man of formidable pedigree. This alliance was a bold assertion of autonomy, a calculated risk to protect her lands from French encroachment. For a moment, it seemed as if Maria might succeed in forging her own path, breaking free from the ever-tightening loop of familiar blood.
But dynastic fate proved impossible to escape. Though the union was hailed as a triumph of strategy, it was also the joining of two families already linked by generations of intermarriage. The celebration of the match could not obscure the anxiety that trailed behind, the realization that, despite her resistance, Maria's children would be born into the same genetic web that had ensnared their ancestors. The cycle had not been broken, only reinforced under a new name. Maria's married life was brief and turbulent. Political unrest, the challenge of maintaining control over her inheritance, and the pressures of childbirth wore at her health and spirit. The responsibilities of rule fell heavy on her shoulders, and in the end, the promise of freedom faded into the old reality of sacrifice. Her untimely departure left Maximilian to govern Burgundy and Austria alone, their children, most notably Philip the Handsome, carrying not just their parents' legacy, but the increasingly fragile thread of a family whose blood was now more insular than ever. With each passing generation, the consequences of this heritage became clearer. The children and grandchildren of Maria and Maximilian showed signs of inherited ailments, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Delicate constitutions, anxious temperaments, the reemergence of recognizable features that betrayed the closeness of their parents' kin. The genetic circle, instead of loosening, wound ever tighter, and the dreams of independence that had once inspired Maria dissolved into a pattern that no single willpower could break. Maria of Burgundy is remembered for her courage and resolve, a young woman who dared to steer her own fate, if only for a moment. Yet her story is tinged with melancholy, a testament to the powerful forces that bound Europe's royal families,
and the nearly impossible task of escaping the legacy of blood. Her brief attempt at freedom became instead a turning point in the very machine she hoped to evade, an engine that continued to generate both the glories of empire and the quiet tragedies of its daughters, whose lives were written less by their own desires and more by the stubborn mathematics of lineage. Her descendants would come to bear the marks of both her ambition and her captivity, a reminder that, in the end, even the boldest dreams could be quietly absorbed by the relentless pull of inheritance. Maria's legacy is thus a paradox, a symbol of independence swallowed by the very system she tried to outwit. Her life a whisper against the roar of history's unbroken wheel.
Anna of Austria's life was bound tightly within the most constricting circles of European royalty, a world where the word family meant both safety and a subtle, creeping peril. Born to Philip II of Spain and his niece, Anna was herself the living proof of a dynasty that had become ever more inward-looking, its branches curling back upon themselves with increasing urgency. Even among the Habsburgs, known for their deliberate unions between cousins and close kin, Anna's fate was extraordinary. She would become both the daughter and the niece of a king, and eventually the wife of her own uncle. The match between Anna and Philip II was the product of strategy pushed to its most dangerous extreme. The dynasty's obsession with consolidating power, territory, and religious unity left little room for outside alliances. Advisors, courtiers, and even the church itself found ways to justify the union, arguing that only such a marriage could preserve the house's political supremacy and maintain the hard-won stability of Spain and the empire. The wedding, celebrated with all the usual pomp, could not disguise the uncomfortable reality. Anna's marriage to her uncle marked the closing of a circle that had been shrinking for generations. In her new role as queen, Anna navigated a court heavy with ritual and expectation, her every move scrutinized for signs of success or failure. Despite her youth, she displayed a gentle strength and a remarkable ability to adapt, quickly becoming a source of comfort to her much older husband. Yet, within the gilded halls, the true cost of such close union began to reveal itself. Anna's health, already delicate from childhood, was repeatedly tested by the burdens of frequent pregnancies, each one an anxious hope for an heir who would embody both the might and the fragility of the Habsburg line. The birth of their children, especially the long-awaited son and heir, was met with celebration, but it was clear that the blessings of lineage came with an ominous price. The children of Anna and Philip, most notably the future Philip III, grew up under the shadow of mysterious illnesses and constitutional weakness. The royal nursery became a place of constant worry, where each new symptom hinted at a legacy of inherited vulnerability. The familiar features of the Habsburg jaw and chin appeared ever more pronounced, but these outward signs were only the surface of deeper troubles that doctors could not explain and that priests could only soothe with prayer.
As Anna's marriage progressed, the court began to see a pattern repeating with disturbing clarity. Infants who struggled to thrive, children whose minds seemed clouded, young princes and princesses whose lives were marked by fragile health and melancholy. The relentless narrowing of the family tree had led to a cascade of risks no one could fully control, and Anna's own struggles became a silent warning to those who watched the dynasty's fortunes rise and fall. Despite the pressures she faced, Anna remained deeply loyal to her family and her duties. She served as both consort and confidant to Philip, her presence a rare source of light in his often somber world. She poured her energy into her children, determined to protect them from both the dangers of the court and the invisible dangers of their shared ancestry. Yet her efforts could not change what had already been set in motion by generations of strategic choices. Anna's story marks a turning point in the long saga of Habsburg ambition. Her marriage to Philip II, so meticulously planned and celebrated, stands as a symbol of both the height of dynastic power and the beginning of its unraveling. The visible decline in the health of their offspring signaled that the genetic circle could be tightened no further without devastating consequences. The shadows that gathered in the royal nursery soon stretched outward, casting doubt on the future of the house itself. As Anna's life drew to a close, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, both within the palace and across the courts of Europe. Observers whispered that the Habsburgs had finally paid too high a price for their obsession with purity and control. Anna of Austria's brief, bittersweet reign would be remembered not only for her grace and fortitude, but for the moment when the proud House of Habsburg first felt the full cost of its own making. A cost counted not in gold or territory, but in the quiet agony of its most vulnerable children. Juana of Austria was born into a world of iron will and golden cages, a princess surrounded by men who ruled continents and women who bore the weight of dynasties. Daughter of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and Isabella of Portugal, Juana came of age as Spain's empire reached its zenith, a time when the sun never set on her family's domains, and every royal birth was both a celebration and a calculation. Yet, unlike many of her contemporaries, Juana would not be content to play a passive part. Her story is one of remarkable ambition, of a woman who dared to seize power in a realm that seldom allowed its daughters more than a whisper of agency.
From the start, Juana's childhood was shaped by lessons in governance and duty. She watched as her father juggled the affairs of an unwieldy empire, and as her mother endured the isolating demands of the court. Surrounded by the ceremonial strictures of Spanish royal life, Juana learned early to weigh every word and gesture. But where other princesses faded into the background, Juana showed a sharp mind and a quiet determination to shape her own destiny. Her marriage was, as ever, a matter of dynastic strategy. Juana was wedded to Prince João Manuel of Portugal, a union meant to reinforce the ties between two branches of the same interwoven family tree. The match brought her briefly into the sunlit palaces of Lisbon, but happiness was fleeting. João Manuel's fragile health, a legacy of the same close bloodlines that linked all Europe's royals, left Juana a widow before she could find her footing as a queen consort. Pregnant and alone in a foreign court, she returned to Spain carrying both her grief and a new responsibility, the unborn heir who would become the future King Sebastian of Portugal. Rather than retreat into mourning or submit to the constraints of her gender, Juana defied the expectations of her time. She refused a second marriage, claiming a vow of perpetual chastity to devote herself to her son and her God. In a bold and unprecedented move, her brother Philip II named her regent of Spain during his absence, an appointment that placed Juana at the helm of one of Europe's greatest powers. As regent, she governed with prudence and resolve, managing affairs of state, arbitrating disputes, and even navigating the turbulent waters of religious reform. Yet even at the height of her authority, Juana was never truly free. Every decision she made was watched, questioned, and second-guessed by a court uneasy with a woman in power. Trusted advisors and ambitious nobles circled, eager to exploit any sign of weakness or error. The demands of family, her role as mother, sister, and daughter, were constant, pressing in on every side. The weight of her bloodline, the expectations of her house, and the limitations of her era formed an invisible barrier that intellect and will could never quite breach. The personal cost was steep. Juana's health, already delicate, began to fail under the unending strain. Letters and diaries hint at periods of exhaustion and isolation, moments when the responsibilities of rule grew almost unbearable. She watched from afar as her son, King Sebastian, grew up shadowed by the same inherited fragility that had marked her own generation. The great promise of her regency was tempered by the knowledge that, for all her skill and resolve, she could not shield her family or herself from the consequences of centuries of insular marriage.
Juana's later years were marked by a retreat from public life into religious devotion. Yet, even in the quiet of her final days, her legacy endured. She became a symbol of what a woman could achieve, a fleeting glimpse of possibility in a world determined to keep its daughters circumscribed by blood and custom. Her story, filled with both triumph and restraint, reveals the cruel paradox at the heart of Europe's dynastic history, that even power could not break the cycle of inheritance, nor could intellect or virtue free a royal woman from the destiny written in her veins. In the chronicles of her family, Juana of Austria stands as both an exception and a warning, a woman who dared to play the game, only to find that the rules could never truly be changed. Her reign, as brief as it was brilliant, shines as proof that even the most determined spirit must still reckon with the shadows cast by blood, legacy, and the relentless machinery of history. Through the centuries of Europe's dynastic entanglements, the need to break free from the tightening circle of royal blood became increasingly urgent. Advisors, physicians, and even monarchs themselves began to see what tradition had long tried to hide: the pattern of frail heirs, mysterious illnesses, and troubled minds could not be attributed only to fate. Whispers grew in the corridors of power, suggestions that perhaps, just perhaps, salvation lay beyond familiar family lines. It was an idea that inspired rare acts of courage and hope, marriages arranged not for consolidation, but for renewal, reaching outside the labyrinth of cousins and uncles to bring fresh vitality into noble houses. A few such unions glimmered briefly as beacons of change. In Spain, after generations of Habsburg intermarriage, the search for a healthier future led to marriages with princesses from France and Italy. When Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, wed Maria Louisa of Savoy, a woman descended from a different line entirely, there was a momentary sense that history might be shifting. Their children, though still subject to the expectations of empire, appeared healthier and more robust, sparking hope that the centuries-old curse might finally be receding.
Elsewhere, in Austria and the German states, similar attempts unfolded. The Habsburgs occasionally looked beyond their traditional partners, arranging alliances with the Wittelsbachs, the Jagiellons, and the houses of England or Denmark. Each new union was watched with cautious optimism by courtiers who remembered too well the funerals of young heirs and the quiet absences of daughters lost to early decline. The arrival of a foreign bride brought not just new customs and languages, but the hope that the old cycle could be broken. Yet time and again, these efforts fell short. The legacy of generations was not so easily escaped. Even when the bloodlines blended, the underlying frailties lingered, hidden like shadows beneath the surface. Depression, once dismissed as melancholy, stalked new queens in strange lands. Strange fevers and wasting illnesses claimed children before they could inherit thrones. In France, the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was meant to symbolize both peace and renewal. Yet their union, and its tragic end, became another chapter in the long story of dynastic decline, colored by both external pressures and internal vulnerabilities. The rare successes only highlighted the stubbornness of the problem. The children of these mixed marriages might enjoy a few years of vitality, but the combined pressures of court life, political anxiety, and inherited tendencies too often led to familiar patterns. Some princes and princesses faded quietly, their early promise extinguished before it could reshape a dynasty. Others descended into melancholy or illness,
their lives bookended by expectations they could never fulfill. The optimism of each new match gradually gave way to resignation, as if the roots of the family tree, however carefully pruned, would always find a way to circle back into themselves. For the royal daughters and sons caught in these experiments, the personal cost was high. They bore the hopes of entire kingdoms, hailed at birth as saviors, and soon subjected to the same relentless scrutiny and isolation as their forebears. The pressure to succeed, to be stronger and more normal than the generations before, weighed on their health and spirit. Some, sensing the impossibility of their task, retreated into seclusion. Others sought solace in art, religion, or quiet rebellion. A few, like Maria Christina of Austria, who married outside her family and found brief happiness, saw their stories end too soon, as illness or grief claimed them before they could build a new legacy. As the 19th century dawned, the last hopes of true renewal flickered and faded. Science and medicine had begun to unlock the secrets of heredity, but for Europe's royal houses, change arrived too late. The efforts to bring in new blood, so promising in the moment, had not delivered the rescue they hoped for. The old circle remained, tighter than ever, its costs borne by a generation that had glimpsed freedom only to find themselves drawn back into history's relentless embrace.
The stories of these rare unions, marked by courage and dashed expectation, became the quiet heart of Europe's royal tragedy. For every foreign bride, for every prince brought in from distant shores, there remained the stubborn truth that the past is not so easily rewritten, and that some patterns, once set in motion, continue to echo long after hope has faded. Behind the gilded doors of palaces and the solemn faces in royal portraits, the true cost of Europe's dynastic inbreeding revealed itself not just in policy, but in bodies and minds. For centuries, the elegant genealogies and shimmering ceremonies concealed a growing toll, a quiet parade of heirs marked by afflictions both visible and hidden. As each generation drew tighter the loop of ancestry, nature began to keep its own ledger, inscribing in flesh and spirit what history tried to disguise. The most infamous marker was the Habsburg jaw. Generation after generation, this pronounced forward-jutting lower jaw grew more extreme, its severity a living record of repeated intermarriage. In paintings and written descriptions, the faces of Habsburg rulers seemed to morph. Chins that protruded so far the lips could barely meet, mouths that slurred or struggled to form words, teeth crowded or misaligned. What began as a subtle family resemblance deepened into a signature deformity, one that interfered with chewing, speech, and even breathing. Courtiers whispered, physicians prescribed futile remedies, but the portraits could not hide the transformation. With every royal child, the chances of inheriting and magnifying the trait increased, until it became synonymous with the dynasty itself. Yet the jaw was only the outward sign. More insidious were the immune disorders and physical frailties that plagued royal nurseries. Infants born with low resistance to common illnesses struggled through childhood. Infections that would have been mere inconveniences for others proved deadly. Medical records, meticulously kept by royal physicians, tell of heirs who could not gain weight, who succumbed to fevers or mysterious wasting diseases. As the generations progressed, the number of stillbirths and early losses mounted, a pattern that doctors of the time could not explain, but which modern genetics recognizes as the consequence of a shrinking gene pool.
Mental health, too, bore the scars of dynasty. Depression and melancholia haunted the lives of queens and princesses, sometimes emerging in long silences, sometimes in bursts of agitation or paranoia. The line between spiritual crisis and inherited disorder blurred. What the court called divine trial or madness now reads as the slow, relentless progress of hereditary afflictions. Some royal children struggled in school, unable to focus or remember, their frustration and confusion dismissed as willfulness or a lack of discipline. Others, such as the unfortunate Charles II of Spain, showed signs of profound developmental challenges, difficulty walking, talking, or understanding the world around them. These children were cosseted and shielded from the public eye, their struggles softened in official histories, but recorded with painful honesty in private correspondence and medical notes. As the 18th and 19th centuries arrived, the evidence could no longer be ignored. Entire families were touched by recurring patterns: early deaths, nervous disorders, bodies that failed to mature, or minds that could not withstand the pressure of court life. Some princesses were quietly retired to convents or distant estates, their stories written out of the chronicles, their pain buried under the polite fiction of piety or voluntary retreat. The princes, expected to lead armies and rule empires, sometimes crumbled under the weight of expectation and illness, leaving kingdoms in the hands of regents or more distant relatives. Even those who survived into adulthood often led lives marked by suffering. Jaw surgeries, attempted cures, and endless consultations with physicians became part of royal routine. Diaries and letters, those rare windows into the private lives of rulers, reveal the exhaustion and sorrow that came with watching one's children fade or falter. The pressure to produce a healthy heir only increased the strain. Each new birth was both a hope and a risk, a chance to reverse the trend or to see it deepen. For all the majesty and myth, the great houses of Europe became, in the end, fragile constructs built on a narrowing foundation. Their portraits hung in golden frames, their names echoed in history books. But the true inheritance of centuries of close marriage was a legacy of suffering that no amount of ceremony could conceal. The faces and fates of these sons and daughters remind us that even the highest ambitions are subject to nature's laws, and that the cost of denying them can echo across generations, etched in bone and memory, as haunting as any palace ghost.
For centuries, the drama unfolding behind palace walls was observed, sometimes with concern, sometimes with calculation, by two of the most powerful forces in European life, the Church and the emerging world of science. These were the only institutions with the authority or insight to challenge the old patterns, to ask whether royal strategy was truly in harmony with nature or divine law. Yet in practice, both found ways to look away, or even to rationalize the relentless narrowing of the royal gene pool. The Church, above all, wielded immense influence over marriage and morality. In its teachings, unions between close kin were generally forbidden, branded as dangerous for both body and soul. Canon law clearly outlined degrees of prohibited relationship, and parish priests refused to marry common folk who fell within these bounds. But for royalty, necessity was the mother of exception. When the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance, popes and cardinals proved remarkably flexible. Papal dispensations, formal exemptions to the rules, were issued as a matter of course, justified as vital for the peace and unity of Christendom. These theological loopholes were accompanied by elaborate rationalizations. Marriage within the family, the reasoning went, was a bulwark against foreign threats, heresy, and division. Better to bend the rules for a crowned head than to risk war or schism. The very language of papal decrees was designed to ease conscience and provide legitimacy. Royal applicants cited the impossibility of finding suitable spouses outside a shrinking pool of equals. Churchmen, eager to preserve favor, acquiesced, invoking the needs of the dynasty and the greater good. Even as signs of decline became unmistakable, fragile heirs, haunted queens, and a growing tally of untimely losses, the Church's response was to invoke providence.
Such misfortunes were cast as trials sent by God, mysterious but ultimately redemptive. If a royal child suffered, it was a test of faith, not the result of generations of calculated unions. The myth of divine will softened the truth, and in doing so, made it easier for the cycle to continue. Only the most daring theologians raised questions about the wisdom of so many exceptions, and their voices, when heard at all, were swiftly drowned by the choir of tradition and necessity.
In time, however, a new kind of scrutiny emerged. The scientific revolution brought with it fresh eyes and sharper tools, observers willing to question old explanations and to seek patterns where others saw only fate. Physicians who attended the royal courts began to notice the repetition of ailments, the same jawlines, the same chronic illnesses, the same mysterious fevers. In private diaries and medical notes, the language changed. What had been divine punishment became hereditary weakness. What had been melancholia became a subject for anatomical study. By the 18th century, the earliest proto-geneticists, doctors, naturalists, and philosophers were beginning to describe inherited defects. Their observations, tentative at first, suggested that the bloodlines of Europe's royal houses might be compromised not by chance, but by deliberate design. Whispered warnings grew bolder as statistics were gathered, family trees mapped, and the secrets of hereditary disease explored. For the first time, the prospect of a biological curse, born of calculated marriages, became a cause for anxiety rather than resignation. Still, resistance was fierce. The authority of tradition, backed by the Church's blessing, was difficult to challenge. Royal families clung to the familiar logic of security, fearing that any change might unravel alliances or destabilize the realm. Even as scientific warnings grew clearer, many preferred to believe in miracles rather than medicine. The myth of royal infallibility, wrapped in centuries of ritual and faith, proved hard to set aside. Yet, the fear had been planted. By the dawn of the modern era, the language of heredity was reshaping both public and private conversations. Kings and queens, once surrounded by theologians and courtiers, now consulted physicians and scientists in secret. The first true understanding of genetic inheritance was still a long way off, but the shadow of doubt had fallen across Europe's great dynasties. No longer could the old patterns be followed without question. The cost, so long rationalized away, was now becoming impossible to ignore. The story of how no one stopped the catastrophe is, in the end, a lesson in power and denial. The Church's doctrines bent under the weight of necessity. Science, when it finally arrived, was slow to be heard. Between them, centuries of tradition were allowed to write a story of decline in flesh and memory. By the time the truth began to emerge, the foundations of empire had already begun to crack. Their greatest legacies revealed not in monuments or titles, but in the frail and haunted lives of their descendants.
In the twilight of Spain's golden age, the story of Charles II unfolded as the culmination of all the hopes, ambitions, and the stakes that had shaped centuries of European royalty. From the moment of his birth, Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, was the living embodiment of a dynasty's most dangerous gamble. His ancestry was a latticework of repeated names and closed circles, the product of generations of deliberate unions between uncles and nieces, cousins and siblings. With every marriage arranged for the sake of alliance and control, the genetic foundation of the Spanish crown had narrowed until it balanced precariously on the frailest of shoulders. Charles entered the world frail and fragile, his earliest years marked by illness and uncertainty. From infancy, it was clear that something was deeply amiss. His head was enlarged, his jaw protruding so far that speech and eating became daily challenges, and his tongue was too large for his mouth. His body was weak and undersized, his movements awkward and unsteady. Courtiers whispered that the infant king had the hands and feet of an old man. Some even doubted he would survive childhood. Yet survive he did, defying repeated predictions of his imminent decline, but every day was a struggle against invisible adversaries. As Charles grew, the consequences of inbreeding became ever more apparent. He was slow to speak, slow to walk, and struggled with basic comprehension. His education a tortuous routine of repetition and confusion. Royal tutors reported their frustration in carefully coded letters, describing a mind clouded by fog, unable to grasp even the simplest lessons. Official portraits, retouched to flatter, could not conceal the haunted, weary eyes or the unmistakable features of the Habsburg jaw. Behind closed doors, palace physicians attempted every remedy known to 17th century medicine. Baths, purges, potions, but nothing could reverse what centuries of insular marriage had set in motion. Despite his limitations, Charles II was never left in peace. His entire existence was a matter of state, every aspect of his health and behavior subject to scrutiny and speculation. Ministers and foreign ambassadors debated whether he could father an heir, whether he could understand the issues of the realm, whether he could even be trusted to sign his own name. Rival factions vied for influence, each convinced they could guide or control the king if only they gained his trust. Rumors of sorcery and curses swept through Madrid whenever Charles fell ill, but even his most superstitious subjects could not ignore the pattern that had emerged. This was not the work of fate or enemy, but the inevitable result of choices made long ago.
As years passed, the question of succession became an ever-pressing crisis. Charles married twice, first to a French princess, then to a German one, but both unions were childless, a final, inescapable sign that the Habsburg legacy was coming to its end. The king's health worsened, his days marked by exhaustion, pain, and a deepening sense of isolation. He was said to suffer from epileptic seizures, frequent infections, and chronic digestive problems. His speech, always difficult, became harder to understand. His memory faltered. His moods darkened into fits of anxiety and depression. In his later years, Charles was often described as more ghost than king, a pale figure wandering the corridors of the Escorial, surrounded by anxious courtiers and the echo of unfulfilled destiny. Charles II's reign saw the slow unraveling of Spain's power. Once the mightiest empire in the world, Spain was now beset by economic decline, military defeat, and internal strife. The king's inability to produce an heir set off a scramble for succession that would plunge Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that redrew the map of the continent and shattered the illusion of Habsburg invincibility. With Charles's passing, the crown passed to a new dynasty, and the long, haunted experiment of royal inbreeding reached its inevitable conclusion. In the annals of history, Charles II remains a tragic symbol, a gentle, bewildered monarch whose suffering became the final chapter in a story written by ambition and denial. The empire he inherited had been built on the logic of blood and the quest for control, but his life revealed the cost of ignoring nature's boundaries. As the Habsburg line faded, the lessons of his reign lingered, that power cannot shield against the quiet laws of inheritance, and that even the greatest empires are, in the end, subject to the limits of flesh and fate. Long after the last Habsburg jaw had vanished from the thrones of Europe, the echoes of royal inbreeding continued to resonate, not just in the archives of historians and the libraries of geneticists, but in the very questions we ask about power, legacy, and human limitation. The story of Europe's royal daughters and the closed circuits of dynasty is not simply a chapter of faded portraits and forgotten rituals. It is a living caution, a mirror held up to the persistent ambition and blindness that can shape the fate of families, nations, and even generations yet to come. What does this legacy teach us? First, that the pursuit of absolute control over inheritance, over alliances, over the fragile business of life itself, carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. For centuries, kings and queens believed they could build eternal empires by locking their bloodlines, but every careful calculation led instead to an accumulation of silent risks. Their castles may have been fortified, their marriages sanctified, but nature is not moved by titles or tradition. In their quest to seal off the future, they unwittingly set in motion a slow, invisible reckoning, a lesson that power cannot suspend the laws of biology, and that the costs of such gambles are often paid by the most vulnerable. Modern genetics has cast new light on this history, uncovering with clinical precision the patterns only dimly sensed by royal physicians centuries ago. The recessive traits, the inherited weaknesses, the unpredictable consequences of repeated unions within a single lineage, these are no longer mysteries but measurable facts. Scientists have shown how certain mutations, left unchecked by diversity, can manifest with devastating clarity. Yet the lesson is broader than genetics alone. It is a story about systems that refuse to change, about the dangers of believing that tradition justifies any sacrifice. Historians, too, see the saga of Europe's royal daughters as a profound warning. The diaries, letters, and chronicles of those who lived through these centuries reveal the human cost hidden beneath ceremony, the isolation, the grief, the silent endurance of children raised for strategy rather than happiness. Each generation built its hopes upon the last, only to find the foundations weakened by choices made in pursuit of stability. In the lives of these women, the consequences of policy became personal, the echo of private heartbreak magnified until it toppled entire empires. Yet, there is a second, quieter lesson woven through this legacy. It is a reminder that change, though slow, is possible, that even the most deeply rooted traditions can be questioned and reformed. The decline of dynastic intermarriage did not happen all at once. It arrived gradually as new ideas took hold and the evidence of suffering became impossible to ignore. The rise of science, the courage of a few voices willing to challenge the old ways, and the increasing recognition of individual worth all played their part in shifting the course of history. What seemed inevitable became at last a warning rather than a prescription.
Today, as we look back, we inherit not only the grandeur and tragedy of Europe's royal houses, but also their capacity for adaptation. The story of inbreeding among royalty is a story about blindness and discovery, about the limits of control and the necessity of humility. It reminds us that the price of ignoring complexity is paid not just by those in power, but by those who have the least say in the bargains made above them. So this history remains vital. It urges us to question systems that favor tradition over truth, to remember the dignity of those who carried burdens they did not choose, and to recognize in ourselves the ongoing need for openness, diversity, and the courage to challenge even the oldest rules. The legacy of Europe's royal daughters lingers in every conversation about inheritance, every debate about privilege, and every effort to understand the delicate balance between past and future. By remembering their stories, we honor not just what was lost, but what we might yet hope to preserve, a world where the mistakes of power give way, at last, to wisdom and compassion. Step back from the marble corridors and shadowed chambers where destiny weighed so heavily, and the meaning of happiness shifts into view with sudden, breathtaking clarity. In the end, after generations spent grasping for control and glory, the lesson that emerges from the royal tragedy is not about crowns, power, or legacy. It is, instead, a quiet celebration of ordinary life, the immeasurable fortune of simply being free to love, to choose, to belong to no one's design but your own. For all their silks and titles, Europe's royal daughters lived lives shaped by forces far beyond their wishes.
They were trained from childhood to hide their feelings, to accept the trade of freedom for duty, to carry burdens written for them in ledgers and treaties long before their first steps. Their fates, mapped by birth rather than desire, left little room for simple joys: a walk through a village without attendance, laughter shared without consequence, a love that did not serve some higher strategy. The smallest privileges of the ordinary, friendship, privacy, even the right to fail and learn, were often denied to those who, from the outside, to have everything. To live in ordinary life is to taste a kind of happiness that palaces could never provide. It is the warmth of a chosen family, the security of work shaped by talent and preference, the comfort of knowing your future is yours to shape. It is the freedom to make mistakes and start again, to forge bonds not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Ordinary happiness does not shine as brightly as gold, but it endures. In laughter that echoes from humble kitchens, in stories passed from parent to child, in the gentle acceptance of each day as a gift.
The cautionary tales of Europe's royal daughters remind us that true happiness is not built upon the rigid scripts of power, but in the wide, untamed spaces where people are allowed to be themselves. It lives in the absence of expectation, in the refusal to measure worth by blood or title, in the sweet anonymity of a life lived outside the spotlight. What the world calls ordinary is in truth a kind of secret wealth, the ability to love who you will, to pursue dreams unburdened by destiny, to wake each morning with the simple promise of possibility. History has preserved the grandeur of kings and queens, but it is the quiet, unrecorded joys of ordinary people that form the true foundation of happiness. To be spared the machinery of dynastic ambition is to inherit something precious, the freedom to belong to oneself. The world outside palace walls, with its imperfections and unpredictability, is a place where resilience is built not from privilege, but from connection, and where every moment of contentment is earned, savored, and above all, real. In the end, this is the catharsis of their story, that the highest fortune is not reserved for those born to rule, but for those free to live. The freedom to be ordinary, unmeasured, unplanned, unconstrained, is the quiet, enduring happiness that outlasts even the greatest empires. And it is in this freedom, too, often overlooked, that we find not only the true cost of power, but the possibility of joy.